My name is Eric Browning. I am the building official for the City and County of Denver in Community Planning and Development. Christy, go ahead.
I'm Christy Collins. I am also with Community Planning and Development, working on the various sustainability initiatives that we have going on as a member of Eric's team. Amber?
Hello, I'm Amber Wood. I'm with our Office of Climate Action, Sustainability and Resiliency, and we're collaborating with Community Planning and Development on developing energy and sustainability codes.
Hi everyone, I'm Erica DeLello and I'm a project manager for Noresco, working with City and County of Denver on their code development.
Hi there, I'm Kira Winkle. I work with Erica Noresco on our codes and standards team.
And I'm Kristen Salinas, also with Noresco, working on the codes and standards team as well.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much. So with that, let's go ahead and turn it over to Christy for some explanation of more of the big picture goals. And then we'll move on after that to Amber and then into the details of the conversation.
Great. So thank you. So just to kind of run through the overview again, I'll just talk for a few minutes about what the Denver Green Code opportunity is about, the process and the working groups and how this fits together, and the approach that we're taking to suggesting content for the Denver Green Code. So the first thing that I always like to focus on is that rather than it being a code, it's kind of an opportunity. The Denver Green Code gives us a chance to not only jump in and modify mandatory codes, which can sometimes be a bit jarring and abrupt to the community, but to instead ease that transition by providing a preview of what's to come and giving everybody several years to think about where the conversation is shifting and how to succeed, so that when some of these provisions move into mandatory codes in the next code cycle, it's not so jarring, it's not so shocking. The goal is for us to achieve success under the community's vision for Denver and to support that success. The Denver Green Code is not just a list of rules, it's a voluntary code, an incentivized voluntary code right now with numerous paths, lots of electives, lots of options. The more options, the greater the flexibility. So the Denver Green Code was created in 2019. That was the first year. It was a big job to get a new code adopted, and we kept the aspirations of what we were accomplishing with that code modest as we were getting it up and running. We now have a chance to advance it, to grow it, and to make it serve the community's purposes and goals even better. And that's our goal. So we know that we love being in Denver, and we want to figure out how we keep Denver as wonderful as it is today. And that's not keeping it the same as it is today. So how do we participate in Denver's evolution, not only actively, which we already are doing, but consciously, so that we shape it to be what we want it to be in the future? Not just doing less harm, but also doing more good, and figuring out what that actually means for Denver specifically. So why the working groups? Typically, our code process starts with community engagement at the committee level, where we consider specific proposals for adoption, but that's a formal process, and we're already far down the road when we get to that point. The working groups were set up to give us the opportunity to hear from the community, from you first, what issues might impact Denver the most, where can we be focusing our attention most effectively, what are the greatest opportunities, how can new building project development help to mitigate things that we don't like that are happening out in our community, and take advantage of those opportunities, both in 2021 and in the farther future, because the vision for the Denver Green Code is that it remains this voluntary code for many years to come. We don't have a foreseeable end to it. We're taking the long view. It's 2021 is a step towards a no foreseeable end of continuing to present what will lead the Denver community to a place that makes us all happy. So participating in that evolution. So we encourage everybody to think broadly and know that putting ideas out there is a good thing, because more ideas and more options offers more flexibility. Those ideas don't need to be fully figured out. We just want to have the conversation. This is how we're shaping the longer vision. So this diagram and the list on the right is just to make this a little bit more tangible so that we can shape our conversation. And we looked at it last time as well. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So we always really hate putting a list of things next to the whole. And the whole is just a vision of understanding that right now, the way that we're developing Denver, we're taking things away from the resources and from the ecosystem and from the balance. And we need to not only do less of that, but we've got to move into that zone of green to start doing good. And the list on the right is just some of the things that will help us to do that, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about some of those topics more specifically today, maybe than we did the last time. So just a reminder to think big. Every gesture has intended consequences as well as unintended consequences. So just let's always be thinking in terms of the environmental, the economic, and the social opportunities for projects to contribute to a balanced whole in Denver. No project is an island. No project exists on its site alone. So again, the opportunities for environmental, economic, and social positive contribution all overlap. It's one integrated system across Denver. So we just need to always keep that in mind. And also, different sites offer different unique opportunities. It makes it more complex. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, but if we embrace that complexity, then we can figure out how to approach all of this together for the greater benefit of the whole system and the whole city and the whole community. Denver's potential is an evolving community. You know, what does that want to take shape as? And that's a question that we present out to everybody else. We're not here to give answers on what Denver's potential is or how we achieve it. We just want to see the conversation and figure out the right path forward together. So the goal of the working group is to understand and target how we can have conscious, positive participation in Denver's evolution to keep it great, and then to prioritize which areas to focus on for greatest impact in 2021 versus the longer future, knowing that we can't do everything in 2021. So we've got to figure out where we want to point our attention most immediately. And with that, I will hand off to Amber, who will talk a little bit more about some of the specifics that have been being worked on related to energy and in the CASR office. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. So I did just want to start by mentioning that we are not actually talking about energy today, but energy is the topic that we get a lot of questions about and that a lot of our community has really been pushing. So I do want to just go over very briefly energy and then talk about how we're going to put everything back together, knowing that that's not exactly part of the conversation today. So this is the vision of the Denver Green Code. Christy has talked about it quite a bit, where we really want to basically make that the ongoing place where we can test policies and codes that have the potential to become building codes and regulations in the future. This is the process that we're going to be going through that you've all have seen before. And the reason that I'm gonna just touch on energy briefly, the reason we're touching on that is both because it comes from the community, but also because 64% of Denver's greenhouse gas emissions are from buildings and homes. And so that's one of the ways we can reach our climate goals. Our goal is to get to net zero new construction by 2030. One of the reasons that that's the goal is because by 2050, about 40% of our building stock will actually be new construction. So obviously new construction turns into existing construction. Our definition of net zero includes 4 things: energy efficiency, all electric equipment, renewable energy and electricity. Primarily, we're talking about solar there, and then providers of demand flexibility. These are our glide paths. So the path to net zero on the left is for commercial and multifamily, and on the right, we have residential. And Courtney is my colleague. She will be in these meetings moving forward as well. So you'll see both of us. And really, I just wanted to give you a note of energy, partially because we're talking about that in the other working group sessions, but also because at the end of the day, obviously, there's going to be an energy component of the Denver Green Code that will have to tie back together. And the goal is that obviously we want to push energy, but we also really want to encourage you all today to push all of the other topics that are extremely important to reach our city's goals and making Denver a better place to live and work. So that'll really be it about energy, and we can proceed on to the conversation now. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Amber. So I'm going to go ahead and share a link to the mural board, and some of you might be familiar with that from last week's meeting as well. You can go ahead and open that up and join as a visitor. I'm going to share my screen to give a little some instructions on how exactly to use it before we jump in. So just a quick overview. We have these big quick picture questions that we'll be diving into, and we want to gain your input. You know, the goal of this meeting is to have a conversation. So you can either add post-its or feel free to speak up on this call or write in the chat. And so the way that you add a post-it is by double clicking on the left, and you can proceed to type in any comment there. We would encourage you, if you don't mind speaking to your point, to adding your name to the sticky note so that we can discuss your point a little bit further, or even follow up with you after the meeting. To move the note, you can drag, sometimes that works, but I typically take that move button and you can just take it and move it as where it is. Feel free to paste wherever on the board. You know, it doesn't need to be the cleanest looking board either. And then I would just ask that you don't mess with anyone else's post-it notes, leave them be. And I guess the last point is just to zoom in and out. You just use your scroll button and focus in on the big picture questions as we go. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Kira here is going to share her mural board. And we'll go ahead and get started on the first question. Kira, if you want to kick us off here.
I can. Thanks everyone for being here. I would say from the last meeting, we got a lot of your great feedback, and we looked at every single one of your notes on the mural board and all of your comments in the chat. We obviously took away from our conversation last weekend, so that was really helpful. And so from all those comments, we really boiled it down to a few other big picture questions that we really wanted to discuss today, because that really will frame what goes into the Denver Green Code. And I think Christy said it earlier in her introduction, but we want to test measures here in this code that might move over to the mandatory code at some point. And so I think a lot of the feedback we got from you guys last week was considering simplification of the code. That was too difficult. There was a lot in there, but also consider flexibility. And so we wanted to open up today's call with really discussing how we can adjust the Denver Green Code to allow for both of those, flexibility or simplification, or maybe both. So we're really looking for ideas from you guys. So if you want to start on your mural board, putting in post-it notes there, if you want to start engaging in the chat, or if you want to speak up, we would really love to hear your feedback. I think there's, there's a lot of ideas, great ideas that you guys gave us, suggestions, but how do we work to put those into this Denver Green Code in a useful and positive way, right? Where this is a buildable code for next code cycles. So I'll leave it at that, and and I'll let the group contribute. And I don't know, Christy or Kira or anybody else, if you guys have anything to add to that.
I don't. I think that kicks off the conversation. I think, yeah, we're just looking for ideas because I think sometimes when we look at flexibility, that means more options, which adds complexity. When we look at simplification, that means less options potentially, which takes away flexibility. And we'd love to hear thoughts on maintaining a balance.
Christy, this is Sarah. I had a question. Can you, I don't know, enough about how one works their way through the green code, but can you pick a path, or is it like LEED where you have to check a box in each category?
No, that's a great thing. So I'm glad you brought that up. The Denver Green Code has 4 different paths that can be chosen for compliance. And so the 4 paths are LEED Platinum, zero net energy building according to the Denver definition, which includes full electrification, passive house plus all of the non-energy chapters in the Denver Green Code as written, or Denver Green Code as written. Denver Green Code as written has a series of mandatory provisions that if you choose to follow that pathway, which is the Denver Green Code as written pathway, those are mandatory provisions, and there are some mandatory provisions in each chapter, but then each chapter also contains elective provisions just like LEED, so that you can make choices in each chapter to find what's most attainable for a project. So definitely there are options. And part of the idea for doing that is if project teams use the Denver Green Code and a bunch of different project teams use the Denver Green Code as written pathway, we will start to see which options are gravitated to and which ones aren't. And that helps us understand where the pain points are.
Right, thank you. And then it might be good for the group to hear, because I'm not sure, I know we've talked about it briefly, but what are the incentives for developers to choose the Denver Green Code?
For the pilot program, for the commercial pilot program, we offered incentives to 5 commercial pilot projects. And right now we only have 3 that are enrolled. So there are still 2 open. The incentives are twofold. One is 50% off of permitting fees up to $50,000 on a project. And then the other is expedited review, which starts from concept and runs all the way through obtaining a permit. So that can cut multiple months off of the project schedule. So those are the 2 incentives that were offered for this initial pilot program. And we hope to be able to offer these incentives again next year. Part of the conversation that we're hoping to have today is about incentives and understanding, if we've had 3 projects enroll in the program, and we don't think that the Denver Green Code is really that difficult for project teams to comply with once they understand what the provisions are. But we've only had 3 of the 5 come forward. So how can we make it more appealing? How can we make it easier? So that's one of the questions that we will hope to talk about, so that we can consider what to do moving forward.
And Scott asked a question in the chat about the pilot program that we're currently in the midst of, in terms of which paths were chosen. And so we have 1 project currently underway that is following the net zero path. And I believe there is a second one. Christy, can you help me on this one? A second that's following LEED, is that correct?
Yep, we have a LEED Platinum. And then we have an adaptive reuse and addition project that is following passive house plus non-energy chapters. And then we also have a project team looking to use the Denver Green Code as written for their project. So we've seen interest in all of the different options depending on what the best fit was.
What is the makeup of those project types?
One is a townhome project. One is multifamily residential. It's probably 5 stories, but don't quote me on that. It's an early concept, so I'm sorry I can't provide greater detail. The third one I would have to look back because it's been a while since we've talked with the team and I don't want to misstate on it. But the one that is the 5-story multifamily residential is the adaptive reuse and addition project. And then we also have some single family residential and single family residential townhome projects that are pursuing it as well.
Thank you.
And I see, Michaela, you commented on the chat. Would you mind speaking to the 1 and 2 family projects that went through the pilot on the residential side? If you have familiarity with those, just in terms of the path chosen, could you comment on those, or maybe offer in the chat?
Right. So the residential pilot program ran for 2 or 3 months. We're currently not accepting additional projects into the residential pilot program. And also for that pilot, the incentive that was offered was a 2-week review time, and it was limited to projects that were new construction and were not TAs, so type approved projects submitted by master home builders. And then of the 2 projects that complied with the Denver Green Code, one was submitted to comply with LEED Platinum pathway and the other was net zero. We haven't had a residential project that chose to comply with the Denver Green Code as drafted.
So the projects that I was referring to, as far as single family residential and townhome, choosing Denver Green Code as drafted, are yet to come as part of an LDR that was negotiated separately from the pilot program. I should have been more clear on that.
And just to speak in a little more detail about the Denver Green Code and specifically to those residential provisions, I will note that we do have a red line draft document of the 2019 Denver Green Code on our website that offers a great deal more clarity than a previous edition with respect to application for residential projects. So I would encourage anyone that's interested to take a peek at that. That's something that will be formally moving through city council committees and full council in the coming weeks, so that we have more clarity and full use of the entire Denver Green Code, not just for those big multifamily and commercial projects, but for the smaller residential projects as well.
So thank you guys for all of your comments. I'm looking through these right now. They're fantastic. I see a lot of folks who have said, look at outcome-based requirements. So I don't know if there's anyone who's willing to speak up about what type of outcome-based options you'd like to see. I think the outcome base is really challenging when it's not related to energy and it's related to all the other options, right? Because they're not necessarily all interrelated. And so when you talk about outcome based measures, do we look at community as an outcome based measure? Do we look at site sustainability as an outcome based measure? Obviously there's a lot that involves those categories. And so how do we define it so it's not so open-ended, but that there is a path for folks to comply with? Any thoughts on that? I mean, it's a challenging topic, obviously, so. We can move on, and if you guys have some thoughts on that, we can go back to it. The other thing that I see here quite a bit is other green building certifications. So WELL is mentioned, sites is mentioned, Living Building Challenge. So is the thinking that, you know, those are valuable in the marketplace, they're well known, and so there's an easy framework to be able to pursue there? Or, you know, do you think that that would be an optimal path for this in addition, or as a performance compliance path?
I guess I'd
So-
like to ask a question about how you use a certification system in general. I put that question about LEED Platinum. Those certification systems and the certifications that come out of those usually don't happen until many months, sometimes even longer than that, after the building's complete. But City of Denver needs to be able to give a building permit based on documents submitted to the city. So how can you tie a building permit to a certification system that may be years later? To me, that's a very problematic position to take, because that building may not achieve the certification level that it set out to.
And that's a fair question. The way that we've approached it is that we need to see that the project is on track. So targeting an appropriate number of credits above and beyond the minimum to reach platinum. It doesn't hold up the permit. We require that the stated or the targeted certification, the proof of the targeted certification be submitted within 18 months of CO being issued. Right now, there isn't a penalty if a project team doesn't achieve that. The Denver Green Code is a voluntary program, and there's some good faith associated with pursuing this program. So we can't guarantee that a team will get there, but the understanding is that the team is in it to get there, and that is the intention, and that they've enrolled in the program in good faith to make every effort to get there, which when there is that sort of dedication, teams typically can achieve the goal. It's how badly do they want it?
Got it. Okay, thanks for that explanation.
There's an interesting comment from Lauren in the chat, which is a unique way of approaching incentives. And it mentions incentives could take place after the certification, which is kind of, you know, flipping the idea on its head, at least if we're talking about this from a monetary perspective, but certainly a unique way to potentially increase accountability. So appreciate that comment.
Hi, everyone. I have a comment about the kind of following the post-construction certification path. I don't know if there is a way that we can connect reporting to the code process. So reporting is now mandatory, right? For certain, at least with energy, is mandatory for certain buildings. I think it's 25 or 50,000 square feet or better, maybe lower that square footage and attach that to the code to have evidence moving forward that these buildings are performing as they were designed.
And certainly with the zero net energy path, it's our intention to require that reporting to show that zero net energy has been achieved. So that was the intention with that path, along with some additional documentation, because it wouldn't just come through the benchmarking. I think it's trickier for us for any other path, just because the benchmarking only ties to the energy component, and the other paths all have the other complexities. But definitely, I like the idea of tying it to the benchmarking, because we already have it and it's already there and it's easy for everybody.
Christy, is there is there a way that some of these plans can design, because we kind of talked about last week about providing options, preferred options based on what a neighborhood or an area needs. So to take forestry, for instance, or even water quality with permeable and impermeable, would there be a way to say, maybe the city prioritizes certain objectives for neighborhoods and say, if you are going to build or upgrade or whatever within these neighborhoods, here are the priorities. So in our case, let's say that in Sun Valley, there's a 20% canopy cover goal, and Sun Valley is now at say 9% or whatever it is. If they provide more, excuse me, tree canopy for that percentage, to meet that percentage, then wouldn't that be a way to catch some of these things up front? And I totally agree with providing the incentives after the project is completed, because I like the accountability, and it holds people to actually doing what they have stated or changing up front, so we know exactly what we're going to get at the end.
And I love that idea. We would want to work with our planning team to understand how to break the city down into discernible areas. We could go neighborhood by neighborhood, and then we would have to see if the different neighborhoods, if that's fair and that makes sense. So the tricky part, the devil is in the details of saying something gets incentivized for one area over a different area. And so we would have to study the complexity. I suspect that this would be one of the ideas that would be for a longer term for Denver Green Code. And I love it because the whole city has to work together, and the different neighborhoods do contribute different things. I think for 2021, we would run out of time to do the thoughtful study that would be required to make this truly effective. Although I'm open to ideas that would prove me wrong in that concern. But I do think that fits very well with the longer term vision of trying to understand how the city is working as a system and how different sites can contribute differently. So absolutely.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to understand what incentives are possibly on the table that CPD can really offer. That we've talked about faster permitting. Obviously, that can't happen after the fact. I guess I'm a little bit skeptical that the city's going to come up with cash to hand out after the fact. So, I like the idea and principle of incentives after the fact. I'm just not quite sure I understand what that might look like and what those incentives might really be. Often the incentives we talk about are additional entitlement, height, bonus, et cetera. And obviously none of that can happen after the fact. So help me out here.
The monetary aspect of it is probably the primary option there, Fred, in that we currently have some opportunities, and especially with the pilot program, whether they could be continued or not. Quite frankly, I wouldn't speak with or speak to with any degree of high confidence at this point. Things change early and often. But from that financial perspective, those fees or reductions could be something that is deferred, potentially. So, it potentially complicates things on the city side, but that's certainly the area that I would think of. But I'm sure that there's others that we could brainstorm as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of it is that you're coming at it from the city perspective. I mean, if there was a broader state program that maybe had tax credits attached to it that you guys could draw into, something like that might be viable. I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing it out there because I can foresee on the part of some of my colleagues in the development world skepticism that the city's going to come back afterwards and hand out cash or something. So just want to put that out there.
Well, I can speak from forestry's end. We have done refunds on money for certain projects. We will, based on canopy coming out, we do have a mitigation fee that is owed. The developer will pay that fee, and then if the project ends up putting in more trees or less trees, that can fluctuate. They may owe us more money, or we may owe them money, depending. So we do have that refund available. I'm not sure that would be high on a lot of people's lists to do that. But at the same time, one of the things that I've thought about and just haven't pursued yet would be forming partnerships. And one for us would be like Denver Water would be a great one. If you install trees, you're intercepting storm water. So why couldn't we get credits for storm sewer charges or some kind of a credit like that that could potentially, be an incentive?
Kira, do you want to move over to our next question since we're already
Just was gonna say we should move over to this.
you guys know what we're going to talk about, which is fantastic. Wonderful comments here as well. Are there any incentives that are not, say, financially driven? Are there any partnerships? Are there any awards, relationships, like a thought group or incubator? Are there any other non-monetary incentives that would drive other developers to this program? Someone mentioned in the chat marketability. So, I mean, a lot of the times when folks pursue, LEED or Living Building Challenge, it's all about how they can market that project. So could this be similar?
Are you suggesting that the city aids in marketing the project for the project team?
Possibly, I don't know. I think this is a discussion, right? I mean, how could the city help that? Could there be a marketing aspect to that? It's a good question.
For instance, could there be like an innovator label or some levels of innovator labels or an awards system or plaques or something that that's something that I think LEED has done particularly well.
I was just gonna actually say something about awards and conferences or workshops or whatever. We used to have pre-COVID our sustainability conference here in Denver. That would be a good way to integrate and highlight great projects and give them awards for those projects. I don't know how much of an incentive that would be, but it is something that's fairly easy to do.
And I think this is kind of a two-pronged question because, we have a two-pronged Denver Green Code purpose. One is to get a bunch of projects just using the Denver Green Code and showing that it is possible and achievable in Denver, because it is. What we put in there is achievable in Denver. We made sure when we went through this process in 2019, and that's a big part of the conversation. Again, when we go through this year, we'll be focused on. But then the other part is getting everybody to read the Denver Green Code so that there's understanding throughout the community about what will be discussed as potentially becoming mandatory in a couple of years, so that the development community has the opportunity to figure out how to succeed with these provisions. And if nobody reads the Denver Green Code and everybody waits for the provisions to be made mandatory, then it doesn't serve that purpose. The development community doesn't prepare. And when we move things to mandatory, there is that shock and there are teams that fail and it doesn't work, right? So we don't want to do that. So help us understand what we can do to bring you into the Denver Green Code, your teams, other teams that are less motivated than your teams. How can we bring everybody into the Denver Green Code? We've got a few ideas, but before I toss anything out there, I would love to hear your thoughts on that part too, because it's really important.
So Christy, one of the things that I think would be very helpful, from my perspective, and I apologize, I have a very narrow viewpoint on this because I'm viewing it as a residential home builder who's building a couple of hundred homes a year in a production atmosphere. But when I read the Denver Green Code, and I did, I really had trouble understanding it. To me, it's much more of a commercially based code with a couple of residential add-ons by tacking on lead and tacking on passive house. What support or who is the support at the city to help me understand? It'd be great for me to know if I'm going to do the Denver Green Code and I read section 1A, like what is the thing I have to do? When I read the Green Code, I've got to go do a whole bunch of research into these other standards and stuff and then figure out, well, does this comply or does that comply? In addition to that, as a residential home builder, a lot of times I'm not in control of the development. I'm only in control of the lot and the house. So how do we break down those provisions in the code that, at least from my reading of it, are development codes, impervious paving and landscaping and open space and these types of things that I have zero control over as a home builder if I wanted to participate in that code? So I think as a bare minimum start, someone like me who's interested in looking at the code, I need help understanding and comprehending how to get through it and what boxes I really need to check.
Okay.
Yeah, I second that comment. I think there's something like maybe dedicated staff to development teams that are going through the green code process, so they could have that person that is an expert of everything green code related, so they can walk development teams through that process, is something that would be really helpful. Because especially with the implementation plan to get to net zero energy by 2030, code updates every 3 years. You know, no matter how hard the city might try to keep development teams updated on these changes, I think it's inevitable you're going to find teams that just don't have the capacity to stay up to date on the latest changes to code.
That makes sense.
I do also want to just chime in here. It looks like we have a couple of raised hands. Just feel free to chime in. You can unmute yourself and participate.
I just wanted to voice it over and send it over to Christy again, but those are great concerns, and reading the green code and reading it over and over and just taking it section by section as we look at it. I do agree with you. There are parts of the code that are confusing. If you look, for example, at the beginning of the code, as we look at that table, and that's something that I think Christy and the building department, we've been kind of massaging and working through that. There's a lot of acronyms. It's really a whole new language. And it's a whole new terminology. And if you don't get in and understand, well, what's an LCA and what's a cradle to grate and all these different terms, we won't have an understanding. And that's just really the bottom line. But I'm going to turn it back to Christy and say that, yeah, I really believe we're massaging this thing right now. And that's why it's a pilot program. So we're going to massage it and make it easier and make it more user-friendly for our community and for us.
And that's definitely the intention. And so this is really helpful feedback. So we know where to focus and where some of the easy things might be for us to address, as opposed to, you know, content and provisions. There's also the administrative use of the thing. So both matter. We want it to be approachable.
I'm going to jump in because I heard two comments about the code being confusing and lead being confusing and acronyms, and that it could be either looked at as an opportunity to bring in someone who is has expertise in that area, you know, and I realize there are budget concerns, but there are consultants, not to say that I'm one of them, but there are consultants out there that are trained to address these codes and these certifications and kind of walk you through that process of understanding how to get through it from concept to operation.
Something else that was really highlighted last week by everyone as an area of interest was education. And I think these comments about the code potentially being confusing and, you know, even getting some consulting help, it does seem to me like we're all going to have to change the way that we're thinking and the way that we approach these problems and find solutions going forward if we're going to meet our goals. So do you all have thoughts on how these incentives could potentially tie to educating and collaborating to find some new solutions?
I don't hear anyone talking, so I'll just mention something. If you look at the HPCP statewide program for monetary incentives, I think it's working really well. There are grants that are given out to projects that are pursuing certification, green building certifications, and they're giving out a lot of that money for those projects. So I think if you look at that high performance certification program as a model, that could be a good solution, at least financially.
So I feel like some of this is about communication and being a resource for teams that are interested. I guess the rest of the question is, how do we get to all of the teams who aren't interested, who are at this point in time waiting to be told what they have to do on a project and are less focused on curiosity and jumping into the Denver Green Code? Because we need to get to everybody in order to have the community be able to succeed if we move these things to mandatory.
Christy, do we ever reach out to people or the city or CPD as they kind of go through the process? Are we just relying on the development community to want to do this, or is there a process where if I'm not sure who at the building department or CPD saw a good candidate for the Denver Green Code, or if we could target trying to get a commercial property in, trying to get a multifamily in, and reach out to these teams versus just hoping somebody reaches out to want to participate in the Denver Green Code? Is there any targeted, we'd like to have these kind of buildings and you're a good candidate kind of messaging from the city?
We did do some outreach to developers who we thought might have projects coming down the pipe. By the time we're seeing the projects coming in, those projects are under design. And so the thought process is already starting in terms of engagement of the team, setting up the process, understanding the schedule, getting team members in place. So we're already starting a little bit behind if we wait until we see a project per se. But we did reach out to developers who might have projects, and I'm sure it wasn't comprehensive. We've had a lot of conversations with our communications team to try to get information out so that there could be teams reaching out to us. But yes, we did actively actually reach out to some of the developers within the community as well, who we thought might have something coming along, so that we could inspire conversations before the projects take shape and the teams take shape, and the opportunity is maybe a little harder to pursue. That's not to say we couldn't do more of it. The challenge that we face is that we need to get to teams super early in the process so that they can actually set themselves up to succeed. The success rate and the cost effectiveness is much higher when project teams make the decision from the get-go on a project and pursue it as, performance is going to be ranked as high as aesthetics, and all of the scheduling and the project team is going to be impacted by decisions that will support achieving all of those goals together.
Christy, go back to your original question about how do you get to teams that aren't doing this and influence them to pursue green codes. I mean, I think it comes down to financial incentives, in my opinion. Most of those folks have found a process and a system that works, and so they have no incentive to change. And what I mean by working is that they have a financially profitable project and process of how they design develop buildings. And so finding a reason for them to change the way that they do something, and that reason being, some sort of incentive that's going to help their pro forma work, and that usually comes in the form of financial incentives. Otherwise, again, they just don't have a reason to change it. They've got something that works for them. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Christy, I was wondering what kind of educational marketing campaign has been done? Because I was kind of late to the table on the whole green code thing, and I don't know if that was just because of ignorance on my end and not keeping up with things, or if it's just because it was kind of this thing that happened and has been kind of organic and is just kind of grabbing people as it develops. But I look at this also as external of the city is, if I'm a Denver resident, why do I care about the green code? And to get to the point that was just made about incentives, I think if there's a broader, bigger educational component that includes the development community as well as the resident community or citizens, then there might be some added pressure of, hey, me as a resident, I'm looking to buy a home or rent a apartment, or me as a developer going to build something like that. There might be a little bit of public pressure that could also be applied here as well.
No, I think that's a great point. And this is maybe another question that we would love some input on. I get a sense that we have a lot of feedback that comes from the community at large. And we talked about this a little bit in the last discussion, but we didn't necessarily come up with a solution to it. We get feedback from the community at large, and we take that to heart, and we bring that to our codes, and we take that to our requirements, and we bring it to a voluntary code, and we attach incentives. But then the development community is hearing something different from the market, and the market's a piece of that bigger community, but the market isn't speaking the way that community is speaking. So the members of the community who are coming forward and saying, we want really aggressive pursuit of preservation of a really wonderful community here, versus the market that is kind of backed into a corner and needs to buy something and doesn't necessarily walk into a leasing agent's office asking for these things. How do we close the gap so that the market is saying the same things that the bigger community is saying? And it's a complex question, but we would love to hear some thoughts on that, because if we could close that gap, then the development community would hear the same things that we're hearing from the broader community, and we would start to be held accountable to the same goals and priorities, where right now it seems to be that there's a bit of a divide.
See, you're absolutely right. I think this needs to be outreach outside of the building industry. So wouldn't it be great if, almost like when, what's the campaign where know before you dig, right? You call the 3111 number or something. It's like, know your rights as a member of a community to, you have a right to clean air and clean water. You have a right to demand that, buildings do not emit, do not create air pollution, that they're all electric, that there's no combustion. Like, if we could just put some messaging out to community members about, here's your rights, you're entitled to clean air, clean water, access to safe sidewalks and so on, and just generate that momentum about, and what does that look like, right? So that looks like a development that provides X, Y, and Z, and just get that big marketing push out. And I put in the chat window that I saw that work very successfully in California around the building decarbonization. That group saw very quickly that, yes, everyone within the building industry is kind of in an echo chamber. So we need to go outside, and we need to start talking to the general public about what it means for your kids to breathe healthy air in schools and so on. So maybe that's how the incentives work. Like you said, it's so that developers, whoever, are hearing that message from both within the building industry, architects, and then also from the community that they're building in as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I do think it's important that folks understand that if
if there are costs like that are associated with that, and if people demand changes, and that adds costs, those costs will simply get passed on to tenants, to buyers, et cetera. I mean, it's, that's kind of the reality. It's harder and harder to make projects pencil out as we add costs, and as we add operating costs. Electrification is great, but Excel's demand charges, most people who are in a house understand consumption charges, but don't necessarily understand demand charges. Well, if I'm going to switch a building over to electric boilers, I've got to anticipate that my demand charges are going to be pretty intense. So I just think it's important for people to realize that the ideals are great. We also have to understand that there are costs, and the costs will get passed on to consumers or users of the buildings.
Yeah, understood. But into that equation, I would add the cost of inaction and the continued cost of, air pollution causing childhood asthma, the continued cost of, the health impacts of not having access to a safe place to live that has clean air, free from pollutants and so on, and the cost of a place that is able to keep people safely cool in summer. So I think we're definitely at that tipping point with our climate risks and vulnerabilities where the cost of inaction is significant and should be weighed into that conversation as well.
I think that's a fantastic point, and something that this group should probably be looking at from a holistic level. What is the price of that? What is, this goal of 2030? Is there a way that we could put a monetary value to that? And as we talk about these incentives, is there a way that we can take that potential impact cost and help incentivize, use that, in a net present value setting to incentivize developers to do this? Like, no matter how much education, how much outreach, how much time savings on permitting, the financial incentives to get this program accelerated is going to be the key. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but people are putting prices on carbon. What is your carbon footprint? If you were to build a net zero building, anyways, we look at kind of mass timber options. Is there a way to financially incentivize people to build mass carbon or mass timber in lieu of concrete and steel? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if this is something that the city of Denver can help supplement. Adam, what you mentioned about the high performance certifications, this is the first that I just Googled it, and I would love to pursue that a little bit more. But if we have this goal of 2030 of getting to net zero, whether it comes from energy savings from an operational standpoint or the actual carbon footprint of what new construction is, quantifying that and providing financial incentives to developers in order to make projects pencil at the same returns if they didn't do this, at least as a baseline, is, in my opinion, the first step in terms of really trying to get this program to gain traction.
Yeah. Well, and Eric, I mean, kind of following in your point, I mean, one of the things that building owners have fallen in line with things like LEDs. As soon as they became cheap enough to make it pencil out really well, people were falling in line and ripping stuff out and putting in the LEDs. And that's an education piece, certainly. I think it's important also to remember that we've got external factors that make it really challenging. I'm in the midst of trying to build a mass timber building. The cost of that over the course of the last 8 weeks or so has gone up about 80%. And so, frankly, we're starting to analyze whether we switch back to a metal deck and concrete just to make it affordable for the nonprofit owner that we're working on it for. So those external factors are also just a killer at this stage.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we're looking at a mass timber high rise, 80 plus feet, lower than 120, falls in a 4B something category, and you look at like what I think a lot of people see as the benefits of mass timber as exposing this beautiful wood. Well, as soon as you get into that category, you got to fire rate 80% of your structure. So I don't know enough about kind of what IBC is looking at for future code adoptions, but I mean, things like that, any incentives to help developers. We're not looking to, you know, profit off of this kind of stuff. We're just trying to mitigate the additional costs as a minimum. And as we're looking at mass timber, we feel extremely constrained, and we want to be on the cutting edge of mass timber, but there's just, yeah, this volatility in the timber market definitely isn't helping. But even before that, the cost of these high-rise mass timber buildings was 20-ish% higher than concrete and steel. And obviously both of those have their different externalities, but going back to kind of this initial point, if there's a way that there's a fund set up, I don't know, if there's more accessibility to things like this high performance certification to incentivize people to just, okay, what are the offsets? We're going to put 80% of our building on green roof. Okay, where are we going to put our mechanical equipment? Okay, we got to put that in a mezzanine level. Okay, that has GFA that's now going to reduce our opportunities for, you know, putting units or net rentable square footage into the project, and that's going to lower our return structure. So just trying to find those opportunities, I don't know, is something that I would be super interested in really looking at the details of.
So it's kind of the age-old question: where does the money come from? And I think we would support that incentivization. It's where does the money come from? And I'm not sure. You know, the city doesn't have the ability to go out and collect a tax to put into a fund for the good of the community. You know, like, we don't make those types of calls ourselves, right? So we would love to be able to do that, or to set up a fund, but where does it come from? It has to come through the community. So we welcome thoughts on how we could handle that. I'm not sure I know what the answer is.
Well, if I could,
just one to clarify, I mean, something that Eric just said is really important. I mean, one of the reasons on the small project that I'm working on, where we were looking at mass timber, had to do with the look of it and had to do with that. So in a little 3-story building that we're building, we could leave it exposed, and suddenly that made it an economic winner for us in terms of the project, with the carbon benefits, et cetera. So, you know, if the city could start to look at how the green code could work with the rest of the code to help incentivize some of those things, you know, if the incentive is, yeah, you can leave it exposed, and suddenly you've cut you know, whatever it is, $6 a square foot in ceilings out because you've got an exposed ceiling that's attractive and does what you want visually. Well, there's your incentive. Boom, we loved it. But it just, we often end up in these situations where we run up against, well, we'd like to do this, but okay, now you can't do that. We want you to cover it with GIP so that it meets X fire rating. So that balancing act there could be incentives within the code if we could make it easier for people to do these things that would have huge financial implications for developers, which would lead us to the path of doing the better thing. If that makes sense.
And if I could add to that too, I mean, I think the fact that Fred and I are on this committee shows our commitments to sustainability. You know, we're drinking the Kool-Aid. You don't have to sell us on it. We need to sell the other 98% of the community on why this is going to be a benefit. And if I could just challenge your comment, Christy, to say, okay, well, we don't know where the money's going to come from here. Well, I would love to flip that concept around and say, what happens if we don't find the money and we don't get this program launched to the extent that everybody is optimistic about, and we don't meet our 2030 goals? What is the economic impact to the city of Denver from a health, from carbon, from a energy standpoint, if we don't figure out a way to get this over the line. And that has a value. And I just don't know how you bring that back to net present value in order to find those incentives in order to get this project really accelerated.
And I entirely agree. I mean, that's why we're all here, actually. You know, the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action, but the cost of action is immediate and the cost of inaction is the can that's getting kicked down the road. We set up the Denver Green Code because we don't want that. But at the same time, all my point was that it was, or is that we are, as the city, we act on behalf of the community. So the community isn't coming forward to us with a pot full of money for us to incentivize things. And so we don't get to take and give freely without the community telling us that that's how the money is going to be spent. And right now the community's not telling us to do this, even though we're completely in the camp that the cost of inaction is worse and greater than the cost of action. But we can't make those decisions on behalf of developers and on behalf of the market that is fueling that development. So that's why we're on this question. You know, how do we make that happen? And I think, you know, one of the answers that we've been given back in the past is make it mandatory. And we want to. So that's why the Denver Green Code became this sort of soft way into making things mandatory. We would make it all mandatory and say, this is for the good of everybody. We need to do it now. Otherwise, Denver doesn't have a future. You know, like, we've got to preserve Denver's future. We've got to figure out how to make Denver's future bright. But we can't do that because there is a large percentage of the community that comes forward and says, stop, we can't afford to do this in our development today, right now. So we're looking for help on how to navigate this, because we introduced the Denver Green Code to make it softer and easier so that everybody would have time to figure it out. Because a lot of the things that are being suggested to raise the level of performance on projects don't actually add a ton of cost if they're considered from early concept on the project, and if the team is a fully integrated team, and if the team is fully outfitted in order to track these goals, and if performance is truly given ranking equal to aesthetics, and if the two are considered in tandem. The problem is that on a lot of projects, this becomes an idea, you know, after the concept is created and the team's heading into SD and a lot of the team members are already selected and it's already structured. And it's too late to do it as cost effectively. And the later the decision is made, the more additional cost becomes associated with it. So we are looking to the community to help us understand how we can support a shift in process to make this cost effective and to just have teams change the way of working, because a lot of this can be accomplished if teams just change the way they work. It's not just paying for extra stuff that gets stuck on a building. But we can't force the development community to change the process and the way schedules are structured to accommodate these considerations.
Christy, I think it's a great segue to our last big picture question. And I think we've already touched on it quite a bit here already, and there's a lot of sticky notes, but you know, we've been talking about education, right? And how do we educate the community so that this is a more prominent and used, you know, voluntary code. And there's some fantastic comments here already with partnerships, you know, educating people on that it's not just an energy code, but there's more to it. You know, as well as using these people on the phone, right? You guys are a big part of this community and leveraging, you know, your passion for green building to the greater whole. So I would love if anyone who's already dropped a Post-it note here would love to elaborate on any of these. That would be helpful. And then I think after this, we're gonna try and hit some key categories like site sustainability and water in the next 45 minutes. So try to leave room for that.
Hey, Christy, as far as some of the things that have been brought up, it seems to me like a lot of these conversations are centering around individual products or projects. So part of this education campaign should be the modeling of, based on the amount of people that are moving to Denver on a yearly basis, and we have those numbers projected out for a decade or longer, what happens, what is that bottom line if we do nothing? You know, if we don't plant any more trees, if we continue to make all the surfaces, you know, impermeable, if we continue to build high density residential, but we're not doing any kind of energy modeling or switching over to, you know, a solar or these other forms, you know, I don't think we'll ever get fully away from fossils and some of these other ones, but everything used in a combination can help. And we can model that stuff out to show what the impact is, hey, if we don't do this, here's what you taxpayer are going to be paying, because now your storm sewer bill just went up because we have more flow of water that we have to capture and we have to treat. You know, and I think we kind of look at this as, yes, this is a voluntary process to figure out how we're going to mandate things down the road, but at the same time, it always comes down to the bottom line, you know, and that's what's been suggested here as well, is that until it costs more to build without doing these things, there really is an incentive. I mean, nobody's going to. There's a lot of those times when you just have to ultimately say, you know what, is what it is. Here's what's going to happen from now on. And I get that's kind of what we're trying to do, is model this into what that becomes. But you know, like I said, it's the bottom line. So until it becomes more expensive to keep building like we're doing, I don't think we're going to get a switch, because they're the people that want to do good are going to do that. The people who are just in it for profit or to build and get out quick are going to continue to do so. At least that's what I've seen on my end from the interactions I've had with various projects and developers and you know.
So the short way of answering that is to say it kind of kicks us back to, we make it all mandatory, and the teams that are able to succeed with it all being mandatory because they're able to figure it out and make it cost effective, because a lot of these things are possible to make cost effective. And then the teams that can't, it costs more. But then the teams that can't afford to build in Denver. And that is something that the community will have a pretty adverse response to, because it has an economic impact in the immediate, right? Like if we start driving development out of Denver, that opens a really, really interesting conversation. There are other cities that have done that, but the city's not here to make decisions like that on behalf of the community.
So
we can't.
Yeah, and I kind of look at it from my experience with DHA. You know, they are now incorporating solar into their projects. At some point in time, they had to have reached that tipping point where it made more sense to do solar than to not do solar. You know, and we worked with them a few years ago to do the modeling to show them, hey, here's where you can, you know, put your solar here where you're proposing. So here's how we're going to plant trees to accommodate your solar. So not only do you get the benefits of solar, but you're also getting the benefits of the trees. And as technology gets used and as people are forced into it, that new technology comes down. I mean, you look at solar when it first came out versus what solar costs now. Huge difference. Look at the technology advancements that have been made, all because things started to go kind of down the mandatory pathway. So some of that gets answered based on, you're right, cost of business is going to be more upfront, but it levels out, gets cheaper as it goes on. You know, I just, the money thing, I mean, it's always going to come down to the money thing.
And I'll just put this into addressing both of those comments. So if this just becomes a mandatory thing, that's going to increase the cost of construction. It's going to potential risk of, you know, having to carve out GFA for facilities that are going to reduce net rentable square footage. Going back to Fred's point, this is just, it's all just going to be passed to the end user. So two options are going to happen. Either developers are going to continue to build, and I'll just, again, multifamily context, rents are going to get higher. or it's going to get to a threshold with some developments that projects aren't going to pencil and development is going to slow. That will create, again, multifamily context, create less supply for the influx of people, which will also increase rents. And that's going to just further exacerbate the attainable housing conversations that I know are happening in different groups within the city. So again, I mean, I think that there's an opportunity to incentivize people without making this mandatory if it needs to go to that. I mean, I don't necessarily have control over it, but I mean, I'd love to be a part of the conversation about how to make that possible.
You know, and I feel a little bit like the concept of holistic sustainability gets lost. I mean, we really do, it seems, focus very much, and to call it a green code, we're focusing very much on the environmental piece. I do feel like the social and financial sustainability pieces get kind of lost, and it really entails taking a very overarching look at it. And frankly, it probably starts to talk about how this works in conjunction with zoning, how this works in conjunction with some of our social objectives. You know, is there a special, do you get points for being a nonprofit who's building? Well, it doesn't sound like it, but you know, as we talk about nonprofits being displaced, because we talk a lot about residential displacement, but we're seeing a lot of nonprofit displacement as well. And those are very important social sustainability pieces in our neighborhoods. If we don't have those nonprofits here because they can't afford to be here, and if we make it more expensive for them to build, they get displaced, and suddenly we've got a whole nother issue. So again, I think going back and really trying to think about it holistically with that triple bottom line, you know, how can we also incentivize some of the social sustainability pieces and make sure that those are part of this, and that we're not, you know, maybe it shouldn't be quite as difficult for a nonprofit to build as it is for a for-profit developer. Anyway.
I tend to agree with much of what's been said. I think one of the incentives for builders and developers is market demand. You know, if people are demanding that product or that feature, builders and developers are going to be incentivized to deliver it to the marketplace. And you know, the question that we're asking here is what education is needed within the community for us to achieve the goals of the Denver Green Code. What's our sense of how many people in Denver know that there is a green code and that it's a choice that they may have, that they can go out and look for when they're in their buying or renting stage of their life? And that might be step one. Let the community know, hey, there's a green code. Here's what it means. Here's what it's intended to do. Here are the benefits to the city and county of Denver and the residents of Denver. And start trying to drive their understanding that there is a program that's available that they can go choose from and go look for communities and projects that have that have partnered with the Denver Green Code, and start driving that market demand.
Yeah, and I think that ties to some of the basic questions that we're not seeing being asked yet in a widespread way. You know, we could market the Denver Green Code as a program, but I think the feedback that I've heard from leasing agents in the past is that project performance overall is not what the market asks about when they go in and consider whether they want to lease or buy a space. And that speaks again to that education component that you're speaking to. So I'm agreeing with you that there needs to be a broader understanding of how this all ties together, and the Denver Green Code is a way to make it simple for somebody to pursue, so they can, without having to understand all the aspects, they can ask, just like LEED does. You know, it makes it simple so that somebody understands, okay, this project pursued a certain level of performance without really understanding all the weeds and having to spend the time to do all of that learning separately. But I think it probably takes both. It takes this higher degree of engagement in asking for it, which isn't happening at the small scale or at the big scale right now in a consistent way.
Wouldn't that,
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was just gonna say, wouldn't that be part of that educational / marketing campaign where you have public forums where we go to the public and say, this is Denver's green code. Why does it impact you? How does it impact you? Why is it important? And then ask the public what they would want to see. I mean, once you give somebody some framework of what to work with, you know, a lot of people work in that. I mean, parks planning does that all the time when they go in and do a master plan for a park. They go to the community and say, what is it that you want in your park? What are these things or these amenities that are important to you? And then they take that public input and try to design that project around that. So why couldn't Denver Green Code do something similar to that, where we go to the public and ask, you know, here's the framework, give us some thoughts, give us some ideas. What makes it, you know, like they're saying, if I am looking for a place to rent and I have little money to do so, my options are pretty limited. So why would I care if developer A built per green code versus developer B who didn't, but developer B is charging a lot less? I'm going to go with developer B, right? So somehow we've got to overcome that. And maybe some of that is through that public outreach. I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah, it's definitely a shift in priorities. Instead of focusing on the countertop, you focus on what is this, you know, do you have some great features from a performance standpoint? We're not there yet as a community in a generalized sense. So that all makes sense. The bigger challenge is the massive scale of the community outreach required to accomplish this education and how that is actually pursued. But I think we completely agree that would be a really helpful piece in this equation.
Christy, I can tack on to that also by saying, you know, I'm part of my neighborhood association in the neighborhood I live in, and there is really limited participation. So if you're trying to access the public, you're going to have to do more than just go to neighborhood association meetings. It's going to have to be an all-out blitz in all different corners of the city, with all different organizations and nonprofits and for-profits. I mean, it is huge to get something like this out. Like Eric said, we're already on board, all of us, but to educate the public it takes a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of effort, and it should be done, but how it gets done is a big conversation.
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of tack on that too, knowing that it is such a huge effort, and seeing public meeting after public meeting being pretty poorly attended. That I kind of think the first focus might be this developer outreach and focusing on that, or what are the no cost options? What are the medium costs? Because, and Christy, you've heard me say this before, but I believe the community has been speaking about this since 2015 when the Green Roof Initiative got started. We passed that, they passed the parks tax, they passed the Mile High Flood District tax. They made CASTR a climate office. You know, the community, in my opinion, has been very clear what they want. Unfortunately, the market is in a place where you got to take what you can get, and you don't get a lot of choices. So I think, you know, really trying to get people into the program and showing them what, you know, from the city side, here are the things that you can do that are pretty low cost. And here's your return, and having some targeted education just to get more developers in the program.
I agree. I'm going to throw one out there too. I do totally agree. I think that the gentleman who made the comment before, we need to fire on all cylinders. And the reason I bring up education consistently is because as an inspector, I mean, I just left one where I got everybody on speakerphone, unfortunately, should have warned you, but he's like, hey, what are you guys talking about? And he goes, man, I have a hard time. It's the cost. It's the cost. Well, I think education is going to be the biggest part. So to table on that, they need to see the benefit, because in the green code, as you start to understand the different aspects, there are incentives. If you take your trash and you take it to where it's supposed to go, according to the green code, and it's weighed out and all these things, you might get some money back. So there are some initiatives in there that we have to keep in mind. Our biggest obstacle is, like the last gentleman said, is to attack this thing from every single angle. So they see like, wow, Denver's going green, and they are serious. It's a multi-agency involvement, in my opinion.
So I think this is all great. I think we have about 20 minutes left before we're going to need to kind of go into the closing. Do we want to go ahead and jump into some of these topics like the site sustainability and the water?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Just zoom.
And maybe we think about, as the, you know, as the conversation has gone, right, what are those no or low cost options as we're talking about these different sustainability goals, right? I mean, these measures that are in the green code, how do we make this accessible? How do we make this successful? So Kira, I don't know.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you guys are on the website, if you kind of zoom out a lot and go down a little bit, we have broken out the code into the chapters, and then we've also added some areas for these other categories that were in the big picture topics that we discussed last week. So in the chapter 5, site sustainability, it's this top blue box. We took some solutions that you all had proposed last week and put them in, and then we've also got some very tiny boxes where we also have had some ideas, and certainly I think some of these, the idea would be to make some of these mandatory, and I wonder if maybe we could use the star. We have these icons over here. Maybe we have some hearts or some stars or some X's. If there are ideas here that you see that that you think are productive and that should be mandatory, or you could just add another kind of post-it note to put comments. Trying to think of what the easiest way to look at this as a group might be, since I'm sharing my screen. Christy, do you want to talk a little bit about, for instance, the ecological impact plan, or what some of these ideas could be that could be mandatory versus that could be in the mandatory code versus in the green code?
Yeah, we can definitely start talking about them, but I would really love for everybody else to talk and for me not to be talking. But I'll just start with the ecological impact plan because that's my my pet favorite, and I don't think it's a 2021 necessarily possibility, but in my ideal happy world, every project team would come to their site and try to understand. And so ecological impact plan, this little piece might be 2021, but in the bigger context, in my ideal happy world, every project team would come to their site and try to understand how their site fits within the broader context of Denver as a city and as a whole, and what the opportunity is for that site to contribute positively. And the opportunities might be stronger from a social side or from an environmental side. You know, we've got downtown sites, we've got greenfield sites in Northeast Denver. We have all different sites that have things happening on them. So if a team could come and look at the site in that way, if that team could work with the community to understand also what the community sees the potential contribution of that site to be, then we could get to a place where each project is responding to those forces in a more in a broader sense and understanding the bigger picture of Denver before a project is proposed for one single site in isolation. And so the ecological impact plan is a thought for maybe in 2021, we require and so this is, when I say require, it ties to something else, but so I'll talk to that separately. But this would be just maybe a short statement from each team, considering the impact of the development of a project on the bigger picture needs, wants, evolution, and factors across Denver. And I think it would be a pretty interesting thing to request, because there are a lot of teams who would say, what are you asking us to do? I don't understand. I'm building a building here. This is my site. And so it would start to help bring in all of the developers that are, all the development teams that are working across Denver into this conversation of understanding that there's a bigger city that you impact with what happens on your site. It wouldn't be a huge ask in this initial year, but it would be an introduction of this concept that your building's part of a bigger system. So tell us how your building is going to fit into that system. And it would force a different way of thinking. So in the longer view, it would be awesome if every project took this into consideration and took this to heart, and this is what shaped the project. In the immediate, I would expect that development teams would come in knowing what they wanted their project to be, and this would be a thing that they had to do in tandem with it. And it would kind of be a jarring thing because we don't typically talk about development projects in those terms right now. So any thoughts on things like that? Any thoughts on other things that we can do that can start to shift the mindset to this bigger mindset, I think would be really valuable. Because otherwise we start talking about provisions in isolation and we get into the weeds really fast, and you know, we lose value every time we take the scale down and we break things into more parts.
Well, and a lot of these guys are doing them online, Christy. Is there any possibility to kind of force train them to make them click a button says, are you, obviously they're not all going to build green, but if we force them to click a button that says they're not, their curiosity is going to go up. But what is this green? Or maybe a couple questions that prompts them there. They don't have to build green, but it's going to alert them and kind of plant that seed. Is that something that we might be able to implement?
I don't know. We could definitely talk about it.
So a couple thoughts, Christy. Based on that, if I'm a developer or a builder, I got to submit a concept, or 30% usually is what I see up front. Would there be a way that the city could establish a green team, meaning that when that project comes in, their sole job is to look at that project or that development and say, hey, here are some things based on what you're wanting to do that's actually going to help you lower your building costs, or is going to give you more incentives if you do this versus that. Because I think some of it's just lack of knowledge of, oh, hey, you know, solar actually is cheaper and is a better route to go based on my project. You know, it doesn't always work for everybody, but based on this project. The other thought I had was based on this ecological impact. Maybe that's where we find those incentives by basically you look at that project and say, okay, well, they're proposing to pave 50% of that site, which is going to relate to how many gallons in runoff of stormwater that we're going to have to capture. So if you only do 25%, then that saves X dollars and X wear and tear on our systems. And maybe that's where those incentives come into play, where we start looking at you lessen your footprint and your impact to the gray infrastructure, then that's where your incentives lie.
You know, if we can find ways to be more flexible at the city about ways to do, you know, about innovation. So stormwater infrastructure, for example, as I think I mentioned in the last meeting, I tried to do some for a neighboring site. Well, that would have been green stormwater infrastructure that would have given a financial benefit to me down the road related to this other piece of property. But we couldn't figure out how to administer it at Dottie. So we just couldn't do it. All of the engineers thought it was a great idea, but we can't figure out how to administer it. So if we can find ways to enable that innovation, people will find ways to do things like that have financial benefits to them and have those environmental benefits. But if we get shut down trying to do that kind of thing and trying to innovate, then that's where you meet some of the resistance from developers. Well, you know, no good deed goes unpunished becomes sort of the perception. And why should I try to go above and beyond if I'm just going to get shut down for it? So, you know, people will find ways, because there are economic benefits to doing a lot of these things, and there really are. And as developers understand that and find ways to do that, they will take advantage of them and they will implement them. But if we put barriers up and stifle innovation, then the perception becomes the city won't let me do it. what's the letter of the code, and I'm done.
And so tell me if I'm saying this incorrectly, Fred, but maybe what I'm hearing is if we could find a way to usher projects through where the team is actually trying to innovate, and we could try to harness together our different agencies in a collaborative way to support that, that would enable that greater innovation to get some legs. If, you know, like right now, we don't have somebody who can be that usher, but if we did, that could be a beneficial thing on this side.
Absolutely, because I mean, the point that somebody made earlier about, you know, and we've talked about costs and all of that. The reality is as soon as many of these things are really beneficial to the bottom line financially, it's clear many of them really are, and that's an education piece. And the developers and the architects, the design professionals are going to find ways to do better with that and improve that bottom line. But if we need a way for the city to make it work and to bring other agencies in. I mean, exactly what you said about bringing the other agencies together, because that's often the problem. And it often goes to a management level and then it dies. So yes.
A project advocate. Yep.
Yeah, but it has to be somebody with the authority to bring Dottie into the conversation as well and say, hey guys, I know this isn't what you normally do, but we got to figure out a way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Also, if you guys have other concepts you want to add, on this column on the right is where to put it. I know we weren't clear about that, but feel free to add some more Post-it notes.
You know, you might also look at where else in our codes we've got issues that get in the way. I have a very naturalized landscape, very xeric landscape. I have had people look at it and say, well, those are weeds. And, you know, at some point, I always kind of wonder, am I going to get a code enforcement officer who's going to come and say, oh, you have to cut all that down. That's not allowed. So I think that would be also something to be looking at long term. You know, I think that there's still code enforcement stuff out there that if you have a naturalized landscape that you don't mow with native grasses, that somebody can call and complain. And I've heard of that happening to people.
And Fred, I would second that. Working internally, Dottie and Forestry don't always see eye to eye when it comes to projects, as some people are aware of. But you make a great point, is that what one agency requires based on how they need their system to work can work completely opposite of what another agency wants. You know, Sarah's group with water quality and us, you know, we're still working through what works for water quality that's going to allow the water to drain fast and get clean, but also maintain plants. So, you know, we're trying to work together and come up with whatever that magical mix is going to be. And maybe we get to the point where we just say, it doesn't happen, but here's another solution where we do something else. So I think, Christy, that is a huge hurdle that needs to be overcome internally, is getting agencies to start talking and start advancing how we do things for everybody and not just as a silo.
And honestly, the Denver Green Code, part of what we're hoping the Denver Green Code can accomplish ties to that exactly. We want all of the agencies at the table together. You know, it may have started in CPD, in the development services world, but the content ranges well beyond, the aspirations range well beyond what the building codes typically govern. And we need those partnerships. So it's a process, but completely agree that collaboration is integral to making projects successful, and more cost effectively so.
And I following on what Jim just said, I mean, I think there's not one great sustainability answer. And in some cases, a single sustainability improvement might have other impacts as well. And so I think we need to also be open to that and saying, well, okay, what's the best answer here? Or, you know, if we get very prescriptive as we tend to do in Denver, you know, this is the line on this and this is the line on that. What's best for stormwater might not be best for the tree. And so we have to have that conversation, and that goes throughout this.
I think that seems like a good segue just for the last few minutes, moving over to water efficiency, because I think that was also one of our really high priority concepts. And as Kristen said, we've kind of created a space over here for you all to add your ideas over on the right here.
I mean, in this water section, right, what are the low and no cost items? You know, what could be prescriptive? You know, should we look at water sense requirements? Should we look at other things besides flow rates that would impact here? Should we look at gray water, black water, those types of innovations?
So a webinar I was just involved in last week came out of Arizona, and one of the things they are doing is water harvesting. So they are looking at storm water as well as gray water. I can't remember the name of the community. They get 11 inches of precip a year, so 4 inches less than Denver. And they had shown some case studies where they had taken certain development and said, okay, this half is going to harvest and use gray water. And then the other half of the community hadn't. And it was amazing the difference in the greenery on the side that was harvesting and using gray water. They weren't doing irrigation like what we use here in Denver with potable water and irrigating. They were just using harvested storm water and gray water. And right now, some of the things that they're doing there would not be allowed in Denver. So that's some of those things I think we need to look at, is working with Denver Water and Mile High Flood District and figuring out how do we allow these kinds of things to happen. So we really need to develop some partnerships.
Yes.
Well, you're going to have to bring in the farmers to that conversation too, Jim, because there's a lot of senior water rights issues in this state that are keeping all this stuff from happening, and it's going to come to a head at some point.
Yeah, my understanding is agriculture uses about 90% of our water.
Yeah, I heard 80, but yeah, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I think that there are some actual, to your question of are there kind of low-hanging fruit, and I do believe that combining landscape efficiency and stormwater harvesting is very possible. So I think that there's things, and that do not interrupt with state water law. Sorry, my daughter's in the tub yelling for me. But I think there's things that are easy on the design that we can actually implement. We just have to be kind of more thoughtful about that in the code.
Thank you.
And I guess from some of the work, and there are a couple people on this call who I think have been really actively involved in pursuing the One Water plan, then the study that the city has been doing related to that. Jeff, you included. I guess I would ask, has anything come from that conversation as being particularly difficult from the standpoint of moving it towards regulations? Are there things that we could start suggesting in the Denver Green Code that we think would be good for the community to be considering doing, but that we're just not ready to make mandatory relative to our water practices? And I'm just not involved enough in the discussions related to the One Water plan to be able to float out a bunch of things from that myself necessarily today, but I would love to hear.
Hey, Christy, it's Dave Jola with Dottie. So yeah, all of the things that have been mentioned, gray water, reuse, conservation, water efficiency, rain harvesting, but then recognizing the water rights challenges and augmentation that would have to happen if you were going to really harvest that rainwater for a long period of time, are all part of the conversation. And the One Water plan is identifying those as opportunities to increase just our overall water cycle health, but not prescriptively saying where and how we do it. That will be a follow-up activity for the leadership group from the One Water plan to carry forward. So coordinating with you on this effort would make a ton of sense, but it's not there yet.
And that's perfectly fair. And so that's great, because then we'll keep it on the radar. And even if it can't really inform things that we change in 2021, it can inform what we're shaping for the future. And that's, you know, a large part of the intent here today. We can't address everything this year.
As you probably know, in Denver Water's new administration building, everything that they did around the on-site water reuse and water recycling with the, the machine and the One Water concept applied on the site, Denver Water was very, very intentional throughout the whole process that everything they did has to be able to be replicated by any member of the Denver community. So if it would be worthwhile, sharing some information about what they did in the admin building, I'd be happy to coordinate that. But it is all very, very intentionally able to be replicated by any building developer, building owner.
I think one thing I don't see on here yet is, or haven't heard discussed, is Blackwater. You've seen a couple examples in the U.S., not a ton, but it could be something to think about in a couple of years. And how do we allow projects to do something innovative like that if they wanted to?
Yep, and still keep it safe, because I know that that's a key piece of the conversation that comes into play when we start talking about it. But at the same time, to Rachel's point about the Denver Water Admin Building, they have a living machine in the lobby of that building that treats the water back to potable quality, and it's not being used that way. And I'm sure that the project team could talk in much greater detail about that than I ever can. But it is being used for irrigation, and it's a start for all of us to see what we actually can be doing in Denver that we're not right now, in large part. And that just came to mind because the living machines can treat water. It can treat black water back to a potable state. In some circumstances, that's done.
And I wonder if some of the other things we could do that would be low hanging, Christy, would be looking at landscape requirements. I live out in Southeast Aurora, and there is massive building going on out there, and they continue to put in large swaths of Kentucky bluegrass. And it just amazes me that that is still happening there and in Denver when we live in a semi-arid desert. Bluegrass does not grow here naturally. So why are we still allowing this kind of thing to happen in these areas where there is no intent for use of that space other than to look at it and have that grass be mowed and watered? I get if it's usable space, like you want people to hang out on a lawn and enjoy a concert or get together in a patio type atmosphere kind of thing. But to just put it out along the street where nobody really uses it, for out here, I mean, honestly is a waste of resources, and causes more problems to the overall environment with mowing and maintaining and all that kind of stuff too. So, and speaking from the tree point of view, we're still planting a lot of trees that don't belong here because we're still allowing high water use for irrigation of the trees. So we've been talking about that internally with forestry too, of how do we start getting away from allowing trees that will work here to allowing trees that should be here.
Great comments.
Yeah, I think that's a very good example of low hanging fruit. It doesn't cost anything. It just give developers the approved list for planting, and then we have landscape that's appropriate, that is efficient, water efficient, and is going to survive the increased temperatures and drought conditions that are surely part of our future, unfortunately.
Excellent. Great feedback. We are almost at time, and I want to give Eric some time to wrap us up. But thank you so much for all of the valuable feedback today. I think that was a wonderful conversation. I feel like we have a lot to chew on now from today. So I don't know, Christy, if you want to say anything, or I'll give it to Eric.
Happy to hand off to Eric at this point.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I do want to reiterate the thanks to everyone on this call for their participation, ideas, the good conversation that we've had around this, all the ideas in the chat that we've been able to put up on the board, and look forward to making additional progress in many of these areas.